Okay, hello everybody. My name is Peter Colosi and I'm a professor here at Salve Regina University in the philosophy department, and I've been teaching here for 10 years. In fact, they just had a little ceremony this morning for all the people who had 10, 20, 30. They gave us a little clapping little thing, so that was nice. Thank you. Okay, wow. All right, thank you. It was very nice, and they had a barbecue with it. Today's talk is called The Body-Soul Question at the Intersection of Philosophy, Neuroscience, and Faith. Okay? So I teach in the philosophy department. I'm a philosopher, and I should say up front I'm not a clinician or a medical person or a scientist in the empirical sense. Although, for the last 12 or 13 years, I've been working very closely with an organization called the Catholic Medical Association. So I work with medical doctors a lot on these sorts of questions, and I teach medical students actually every summer, Catholic medical students from around the country, in a week-long course where we teach them medical ethics from a Catholic perspective. And there's clinicians who teach, and I teach, and we made a book. So I'm kind of steeped in this question. But the body-soul question is one, which I'm going to explain what the question itself is in a minute, that you really do need to explore from many angles because it's such a rich question. So just here up on this opening slide, I have a picture in the middle of a brain, okay? And that can represent for us empirical science. So studying the brain. Empirical science means you do lots of experiments, start with a hypothesis, test it, and then figure out if it's true or not by doing many experiments. The one on the right is Jesus on the cross, dead. And that one can represent for us faith. And faith is also a source of knowledge. Empirical science is not the only source of knowledge. Knowledge is you're a subject with an intellect who can know things, and then there's an object that you want to get to know about. Like today we're going to try to get to know something about our body-soul relationship and connection. And depending on what the object is, you have to access it in different ways. Like if you want to know what gravity is, you have to do experiments to figure out that it's 9.8 meters per second square. You don't have to look in the Bible or for divine revelation. But there are some things that empirical science can't teach us, like Mary was immaculately conceived. For that, God would have to tell us. So divine revelation is a way to get knowledge that we couldn't get on our own, and God decides to tell us. And divine revelation is the foundation of faith. So those are two ways that human beings get access to the world: empirical science and faith and revelation. And then on the left over there is a picture of Socrates seated in the foreground and a friend of his and a woman named Diotima standing there. And that's a scene from the Socratic dialogue called the Symposium, which is written by Plato, and in it there are men at a drinking party talking about the nature of love. And they all give a speech about the nature of love. And when it's Socrates' turn to give his speech about the nature of love, he says that he thought he knew what it was until he met this woman Diotima. And he told her what he thought love was, and she corrected him. And then he actually gives Diotima's speech at the party. Now, I'm not going to go through the symposium here, but philosophy is a separate way of getting knowledge, then empirical science, and then divine revelation. It doesn't rely on God telling us something, and it doesn't rely on doing empirical experimentations. It's just thinking about reality and seeing what you can know about it with human reason alone. And we're going to be doing some of each of these in this talk. So I have to start by trying to get us all, if you haven't thought about the question before in this way, to get a feel for what the body-soul question is. And in particular, we're going to be talking about the brain-soul relationship. One of the things I do in my classes when I cover this topic at the beginning is I ask all the students, raise your hand if you think you have a brain. And, and all the hands go up. And then I say, you can raise your hand for this next question or keep it down, or you can go like this if you want to. And then I say, raise your hand if you think you have a soul. And they don't all go right up. Some of them are thinking, some are going like this, some keep their hands down. Okay? And so there's this question that we have, and we seem to be a little bit more curious about whether we have a soul than whether we have a brain. Going more deeply into getting a feel for this question, if you look at that picture of Socrates and Diotima, notice their hands. There's a lot of hand movement there. I'm going to use that image of a hand to start us to delve more into what this body-soul question is. So first of all, if you think about your hand, you can notice three, you could have more than these, but three relationships to it. One is you can see your own hand. You can touch your own hand. You can hear your own hand. So you can use sense perception to get acquainted with your hand. That's one relationship you have with your hand. Another relationship you have with your hand is you can move it with your free will. You can decide where to move it. A third relationship that you have with your hand is you experience it from within. You feel it as your hand. So I can see your hand, and I could grab your hand and move it with my will, but I could never have that inner feeling of your hand the way only you do. So there's three relationships you have with your hand. You can see it, you can move it with your free will, and you can feel it from within as yours. Now let's pick a different body organ, say the liver. Can you see your liver right now? No. Can you jiggle it with your will? No, you can't. And you don't have any feeling of it within, okay? Now let's think about those three relationships with respect to your brain. Is it like your hand or your liver? Can you see your brain? Can you jiggle it with your free will? Do you have any inner experience of it? No, you don't. Even if you have a headache, strictly speaking, it's not an experience of your brain. Pain is like a spiritual experience, not a physical one. But let's say you don't have a headache. Okay. So, okay. Now, those are some discussions of our body and different aspects of our body. Now I want to talk a little bit about our soul, or the self. And I want you to kind of, this isn't going to be some like meditative thing or something, it's just a common sense experience. I want you to sort of enter into yourself right now and realize that you are thinking about what I'm saying. And maybe you're thinking, I don't know, is he crazy? Or I don't know what you're thinking. Or you're thinking, what do I want to ask him later at the end of this talk? You're having thoughts, okay? Now, those thoughts that you're having, they're not physical. They're not physical. A neuron is something physical. Someone could take a neuron out of your brain with tweezers and wiggle it. But they couldn't do that with your thought, okay? Now, the other thing I want you to realize is that when you're having a thought or an emotion or making a decision, there's you who you experience, yourself, as the one. That's always in the background of your inner life. You don't usually think about it so explicitly like we are now because I want you to, but you always have an inner experience of, yes, this is me, I'm the one having this thought right now. And that is yourself having that thought, which you're doing right now. That I want you to associate with your soul. That's what I mean. I mean the conscious self that you are, that's your soul. That's your soul. And that's not physical. And what the body-soul question is asking is, what is the relationship between those two things? The self that has thoughts and feelings, and none of those are physical, and the body, and in particular we're going to talk about the brain, which is physical. It's a 3-pound organ in your skull. And by the way, one first step that we can make right now is you have full awareness of yourself as the one thinking right now. You're aware of yourself. You're like, this is me. I'm thinking about what he's saying. That's self-awareness. We noticed a moment ago, you have zero awareness of your brain. That means your brain and yourself, at least in that respect, are not the same thing. One you don't even know is there unless you learned about it in a book. And the other you're aware of all the time, yourself. And so people want to know, so people are amazed, we're all amazed when we sit down and think about it, that there's a non-physical aspect to us and there's a physical aspect to us. And the body-soul question is, what are those two things, and what is the relationship between them? Okay? Okay. And there's debates about it. So what we're going to be looking at is two basic views. One that sort of denies a soul and one that thinks there is a soul. But the thing you have to get, which I think you just did by nodding at the beginning, is everybody in the debate, even the people who tend toward materialism, which I'm going to define, they all grant that there are aspects to us which are not physical. They're just trying to figure out how did they get there and what happens to those things when we die, okay? Another way, a little story that I use to get the students to grasp it is if someone could create a little tiny super microscopic drone with a little camera on it, really small, and fly it up somebody's nose into their brain and put the image on here of what it's seeing, you could see brain structures. You could see the amygdala, you could see the hypothalamus, you could see neurons. If it was really small, you could get between the synaptic gap and maybe latch onto a sodium particle and ride it through an ion channel. You could show that on the screen. But if the person was awake when that was happening, and they said, I'm remembering sledding in my grandma's backyard when I was 5 years old, put it on the screen. The camera will not be able to show that. It won't be able to show the person's thoughts. It will only be able to show brain structures, neurons, sodium, not thoughts, feelings, imaginings. Because those are not physical, but they are real. Everybody in the whole debate grants that. They're just trying to figure out where do those things come from, the brain or the soul, okay? Okay. Okay, I put two slides with my sources because in my slides, I'm not putting all the footnotes and everything, so I'll just leave these for the camera. You can see them, look them up later. There's my second set of sources. I'm going to be referring to these various people as we go through the slides. Okay, I sort of just talked about this, but let's go through it a little bit again. So on the left-hand side, we have terms like soul, mind, consciousness, and subjective experiences. And on the right-hand side, we have body, brain. Those are physical things. They're three-dimensional. Like your brain is a 3-pound organ in your head. You know how big it is. You've seen pictures of it. And your body is your physical body. Okay? And those are physical, extended in space. You could cut them in half with a saw. And everything on the left-hand side is not physical. And sometimes in the class, the students will use the word mind when they mean brain, but we're not going to do that here. The reason I have soul and mind up there is because sometimes people use the word soul and it has religious connotations, and so people, to avoid using the religious connotations, will just say mind instead of soul. So for our purposes, soul and mind are going to be synonyms here. Now the next two items on that side of non-physical stuff. One is consciousness, okay? So consciousness is something that comes and goes. Like when you go to sleep tonight and you go into a state of dreamless sleep, you're going to be completely unconscious. There are other cases of unconsciousness, like when someone is in a true coma, not locked-in syndrome, which is someone who's actually awake, but we can't tell. But a true coma, or somebody who faints, those are all states of unconsciousness. Or even, not only do you lose it and have it, but consciousness comes in degrees. Like when you wake up in the morning, you're a bit groggy, and maybe you drink some coffee and you perk up, and at the end of the day, you have this melatonin thing happening and you get a little groggy. Okay, so consciousness comes in degrees. It's tragic if someone loses their consciousness for their whole life, if they're in a coma for their whole life. You still love them and care for them, but it's tragic. Why? Because of the next thing, subjective experiences. By subjective, I don't mean illusory or relativistic. I mean experiences of a subject. So for example, one of the subjective experiences that you are having right now is thinking about what I'm saying. That's a subjective experience. Or if you walk out on the cliff walk later or earlier today and you were struck by the beauty and your soul was moved and your emotional side was like, whoa. That's a subjective experience, okay? What's interesting about each of those experiences, like having a thought, being moved by beauty, making a decision with your will, You can't do any of them unless you're conscious. If you're knocked out, you can't do them. So consciousness is like the foundation for us to be able to do all these different wonderful things we can do, like think about calculus or be moved by beauty. We need consciousness for that. So one of the debate, and if you want, we can talk about some of these side issues during the Q&A. But, for example, the question of brain death. Are people with a brain death diagnosis dead? And I don't think they are. But they don't have consciousness in most cases. Some cases they do. Or someone in a coma. There are people who think if you have lost your consciousness permanently, but you're still alive, you don't count as a person, okay? Those would be people who don't think there's a soul. They only think there's a brain and like subjective experiences, but no soul. And someone who thinks that a person who's unconscious still has a soul, they have the full dignity of the person. It's just sort of sad that they can't do their subjective experiences. And it's obvious, but it needs to be stated explicitly. To be unconscious is not the same as to be dead. If you're asleep, you're not dead. If you're in a coma, you're not dead. If you fainted, you're not dead. You're just unconscious. You can get that back, consciousness. Okay. So, what is the body-soul question? I sort of said this already, but with respect to the non-physical and physical dimensions of human beings, what is the nature of each? So what is this non-physical side of us, and what is this physical side, and what is the relationship between them? Philosophers and neuroscientists and people of faith are continually trying to explain what causes all the things I just said, being moved by beauty, thinking about math or whatever, having a feeling, what causes all that? Is there such a thing as a soul, or is there only a brain? That's the body-soul question. Actually, there's much more to it than just that. I'm focusing on the brain. But okay. Now, there are 4 basic questions about the soul and its relationship to the body or the brain that not only scientists and people ask, but I think every single human being, just by being alive and experiencing things like love and death, has either explicitly or implicitly asked themselves these 4 questions about their soul, or what we could just call the self. The self. So one is the soul or the conscious self real? And everyone in the whole debate says yes. This self that is thinking about what you're saying is a real thing. Second, is it immaterial? And the answer to that also is yes. I already said everybody in the whole debate agrees that you can't take a thought out and wiggle it with tweezers or measure it with any type of measuring device because it's not physical. It's immaterial, it means non-physical. So that's what everyone agrees on. The 4th question, is the soul substantial? So this is a technical philosophical term that Aristotle brought into the discussion. And for our purposes, what it means is that if something's substantial, it can stand on its own. So for example, this podium here is a substance. It can stand on its own. I could take a piece, like a wheel, off of it and throw it over there, and the wheel would also be a substance because it can stand on its own. But think about the shape of the podium. It's rectangular, let's say. Can I just take the shape only, rectangularity, off it and put just its shape over there? No, there has to be something for rectangularity to exist. So the shape can't exist by itself. It has to be, it's real, but it has to be in something, okay? So that's an analogy to say there are some people who think this conscious self is like the shape of the table. It can't exist on its own. It's just coming from your brain. And when your brain dies, poof, it's gone. People who think the soul is substantial say that this conscious self, so you inside yourself right now thinking about what I'm saying that you're aware of, when your body dies, that's going to keep existing. That would mean the soul is substantial because it can survive the death of the body, but it's not physical anymore. Okay? Okay. The 4th question that everybody, I think, wants to know about the soul is it immortal? So there could be someone who says, yeah, I think the soul is stronger than the body, so it's going to keep living after my body dies. But it's probably just going to do that for about 50 or 100 years and then poof, gone. Okay, so that would be kind of sad too. So we want to know, is it going to be able to do, even if it's substantial, will it be able to do that forever? Are we going to have eternal life? Okay, and there you might need some faith arguments, although Socrates does have some pretty strong philosophical arguments in the Phaedo, even for the immortality of the soul. And maybe if you want some philosophical arguments for the immortality of the soul, we can save those for the Q&A, because I want to make sure we have a good long 20 to 30 minutes for Q&A, and I want to get through the slides here. So those are the 4 basic questions that I think everyone asks about their soul. Why do people ask the body-soul question? Because of wonder. Plato said this, for this feeling of wonder shows that you are a philosopher, since wonder is the only beginning of philosophy. Wonder, like if you go somewhere where there's no artificial light and a beautifully clear sky, and you walk out there and your breath is taken away, that's the feeling of wonder. And both Plato and Aristotle said that the very reason why there is philosophy is because there is wonder. When people are struck by something like that, they want to ask questions. That's the beginning of philosophy, wonder. And we are all struck, even if you don't think about it all the time, by the fact that there is an aspect to us which is not physical. It's undeniable. You can't measure your thoughts with a scale. And that's just something to be stunned at. And that's why people ask the body-soul question. Another reason why people ask the body-soul question, which I've alluded to now and then in the talk so far, is real existential questions. So it's not just like a lab experiment, this body-soul question. There are some things they do in neurology labs that add to our knowledge about this whole question. But there's this sort of famous question, which is stronger, love or death? Which of those two things is stronger? You could say, what does that question even mean? Well, one of the essential features of the nature of love is that when you love somebody, you want to be with the person you love. So it's sad if somebody you love moves to another country or another state, because there's that separation. When you love someone, you want to be with the person. Well, death seems like the ultimate separation. Not just moving to another state, but they're dead. When someone you love dies, that's usually when people really start wondering, is there a next life? Because they love them. In other words, yes, you have the memory of the person who died, but the memory is bittersweet. It's sweet because it's reminding you of the person, but it's bitter because the memory is not the very person. You want the person back, not just the memory. So if death is the end, and the person can't exist anymore, then death is stronger than love. But if we can survive the body, and in Christianity, the resurrection of the body, and if it's immortal, that's even better, then love is stronger than death, because then you do get to be with the real person again. And that's what we really want, okay? Okay. So these are the kinds of questions that really make people wonder about the body-soul question. You know, and maybe just to, I didn't say this yet, but, and I'm going to be saying it a lot, but the people who are what I'm calling materialists, who think that the soul is, and they wouldn't even like to use the word soul, but the soul or the self is only real and immaterial, but not substantial and certainly not immortal. Those people, who I'm going to talk about in a minute, there are lots of versions of that view, but the one that's most popular today is called neurological reductionism. And those are people who think that your brain is the total explanation of the self I was talking about and your thoughts. They actually think your brain thinks, You might think that. Socrates would say, people in the future think their brain thinks? Are there that many silly people in the future? It's a physical organ. If it were true that the 3-pound organ in your head is the true cause of yourself and your thoughts, then when that organ in your head becomes mush in the ground, it's not going to be able to make you anymore. So if you're going to think like a materialist or a neurological reductionist, and they would admit this, if one of them, we're going to look at some quotes in a minute, if they were in the room, they would say, yeah, there's no afterlife, there can't be. The brain makes you and it gets dissolved and therefore no more you. Okay? So if you think the brain is the cause of the self and the thoughts, then there can't be an afterlife. Okay. The opposite view of that, this is a quote from a Catholic Church document. I think it really concisely expresses the opposite view of the one I just described. It says, the Church affirms that a spiritual element survives and subsists after death. An element endowed with consciousness and will, so that the human self subsists. To designate this element, the Church uses the word soul, the accepted term in the usage of Scripture and tradition. Now, I do want to distinguish between the Catholic view and Socrates. So, I already told you, the materialists think when you're dead, that's it. Because the brain makes you, the brain is mush. Socrates is the most opposite of that. Socrates thought the soul is so much stronger than the body that it's going to survive the death of the body and it's going to live forever. But Socrates thought that after that last death, because he believed in reincarnation, there's going to come a time when you don't have to have a body anymore, and you're just a soul. And he couldn't wait for that. He just thought the body held him back from doing philosophy. He had to sleep, eat, so couldn't wait to just be rid of it. But the Catholic view, this is a little bit of a side point. So, death was never supposed to happen. Now I'm going to speak theologically for a minute. When God created everything in the book of Genesis, death was not part of the original plan. He made angels before he made this world. But then he made this world and us. And we are a body-soul unity. And it's very beautiful. We're not just a brain-soul unity, we're a whole body-soul unity. We can express our souls through our facial expressions or through hugging somebody or through talking. It's how we share our interiority with others through and because of our body. It's very beautiful. Original sin brought about death, but it was never supposed to happen. It wasn't part of God's original plan. And when Christianity talks about the resurrection, it means the resurrection of the body. So we are going to be put back together. Like the bodies you're sitting on those chairs with and mind, it's going to be us again, back together. And you're going to be recognizably you, body and soul, in heaven in some glorified form. That's the Christian teaching. Death was never supposed to happen. So that's a little bit different than Socrates. But because the Christian teaching does hold with Socrates that the soul is a substance, mysteriously united with a bodily substance, making one substance, the whole human person, we have this idea of the separated soul. There's a time after we die, until the end of time and the resurrection, when you're just your soul, waiting for your body. You could be in purgatory then. Okay. So I'm kind of painting the picture of the different views that are out there. So now, this neurological reductionism. So back to these materialist people. This is the most common view today, at least among neurologists, neuroscientists, psychologists. They're pretty much all this form of materialism, although there are some cracks in that. There's some really interesting things happening. And they say, like I said already, all conscious experiences are caused by the brain. And they get, so just to give maybe one of the arguments they have for their view. So there is, I read about this in an interesting book called When Breath Becomes Air, and you've probably heard of maybe that book by Paul Kalanithi, and he was a neurosurgeon who died. And it's a beautiful book about his life that he wrote in the last year of his life. But in it, he's talking about a surgery that he did. I guess it's a common surgery for people who have Parkinson's disease and they have a tremor. So what they can do is, your brain doesn't have like pain nerves in it. So many brain operations are done on people while they are awake. All right, they have to do some anesthesia to get a hunk of the skull off and so forth. But they want the people awake when they do surgery on the brain in many cases, because if they touch a certain spot in the wrong way, bad things can happen and they need to talk about it. So he's talking in this book about a woman who had Parkinson's disease with a tremor. And there's one brain structure called the subthalamic nucleus, which when you put a little electrode on it, a little bit of electricity, it has this amazing effect of reducing or getting rid of the tremors in Parkinson's patients. So he's talking about putting this on there, and he did it where he thought it was supposed to go, and the patient suddenly says under the gown, "I feel so sad." He's like, "What? Turn the electricity off." "Oh, it's better now." Turn the electricity back on, and she says, "I'm so depressed." And he says, "Take the electrode out, move it over," and then it worked. She wasn't depressed anymore, and the tremor went way down. So experiences like that, which are undeniable, are one of the reasons why some people think the brain is the cause of all of our conscious experiences, because things like that happen. There is some sort of obvious connection there between that electrical zap and the lady's sadness, which is not something physical. And so Valerie Gray Hardcastle, as I said, all my references are on the second and third slide. Just some quotes from the people, just to show you what they think. So she is a neurological reductionist. And I know that's a little bit of a pejorative term, but I think they would own it. They really think the brain is the cause of the self and consciousness and so forth. So she says, "I am a committed materialist and believe absolutely and certainly that empirical investigation is the proper approach in explaining consciousness. If you find structural isomorphisms, so parallels, between our perceptions, non-physical things, and twitches in the brain, then that is taken to be good reason to think that the mind is nothing more than activity in the brain." So she looks at that story I told you about the subthalamic nucleus and concludes this, that the only source of knowledge about consciousness and so forth is empirical science, and the total explanation of it is twitches in the brain cause everything that happens in our soul. Here's another one. He says, the very idea that a cell can have an idea seems silly. So what that means is he's thinking about his view, and he's like, well, if I held up a neuron, one single neuron, could that have a thought? And he's like, no, that's a silly idea. But then he says, however, conscious awareness of oneself comes from just that. Nerve cells communicating with one another by 100 trillion interconnections. So I actually think that quote is a contradiction, because he's saying a single cell can't think, but if you put a bunch of them together, cells can think. Now, this is like the key, one of the key points. Continuing Michael O'Shea's quote, he says, "We have no idea how consciousness arises from a physical machine." By physical machine, he means the brain. And in trying to understand how the brain does that, we may well be up against the most awkward of scientific challenges. So I just want to express this. All of these neurological reductionists, and as I said, it's the majority of like neuroscience, they all assert, as if it's like undeniable dogma, that the brain is the total explanation of all of your thoughts and feelings and experience of self and all that. And every single one of them also says, none of us have any idea how the brain does that. They're all frantically looking to be the first one to win the Nobel Prize that figures out exactly which brain structure or which brain mechanism makes consciousness. And none of them have found it. But they all say it's true. You know, one of the critiques of religious people is they're always just asserting their blind faith and saying we have to believe them. Exhibit A. That is worse. He's just saying, oh, because I zap a subthalamic nucleus, therefore my love for my grandma is caused by... That's another way you can think of it. I'm going to get to this later, but maybe just for a bit of a contrast. Now, and I'll explain it more later, but if your grandmother or someone you love came up to you and said, "Why do you love me?" And you said, "Well, because this brain structure is squirting out some hormones." That would be a horrible thing to say. It can't capture everything about love, okay? And that's really what they're saying. Okay, so the hard problem, there's this philosopher named David Chalmers. It's interesting to look up some of his videos online. He developed this phrase, the hard problem, which captures this idea. He says, the definition of the hard problem is discovering the neurobiological causal explanations of consciousness. That just means nobody has figured out how the brain is doing all of that yet. And they're all looking for it. Okay. Here's another example of the same thing. Maybe it's too many quotes, but we know what consciousness is. That's like I said at the beginning. Everybody knows it's just common sense. When I asked you to think about your own thoughts a few minutes ago, like, yeah, I have thoughts. Yeah, I can't put them on a scale. Everyone knows what consciousness is. Jack Symes, who's also, I think, a neurological reductionist, he wrote a book collecting a lot of their thoughts. Yet it remains one of life's greatest mysteries. How is it exactly that 86 billion neurons in our heads are capable of producing a unified conscious mind? So he just assumes and asserts the brain is the source, not the soul. Okay, no one knows how. And I would say, so I disagree with the neurological reductionists, if you haven't been able to tell yet. And I would say that one of the ways to begin to criticize them would be to say that, and by the way, I love reading these people. The brain is amazing, so I don't want to knock the brain. It's stunning how complex it is and all the things you could learn about it, and I want to keep learning about it myself from these people. But I think they have a very narrow view about human experience. And I would describe their bold assertion of neurological reductionism as an unfounded conclusion desperately in search of a justification. And what I want to do is doubt the premise. It's not the brain that causes consciousness. So here are some challenges. One is the hard problem, so discovering the neurobiological cause of all consciousness. It'll never be solved because it's false. The brain is not the source of consciousness. They would be shocked if I said that. The brain does not cause our subjective experiences. And another challenge to them, which I already said a little while ago, is why should I accept an assertion from anyone who admits he has no clue why he holds it? So now we should locate some arguments. I'm sort of asserting right now. So let's see if I can come up with any arguments that might counter neurological reductionism. We can group them into three categories: empirical evidence against neurological reductionism, philosophical arguments against neurological reductionism, and theological. And I'll do a few. I have a lot more in this chapter that I wrote, and maybe you'll come up with some in the Q&A. So, empirical evidence. And I won't maybe go through all of these now in depth, but if any of these you want to talk about later, we can. So near-death experiences, I don't know if you've heard about them, but there's a guy named Father Robert Spitzer, and he wrote a book. He's a Jesuit priest who is also a doctorate in philosophy of science or history of science or both. And he wrote this book called Science at the Doorstep to God. Science at the Doorstep to God. It's very readable. And in that book, he collected all sorts of really amazing empirical evidence for all sorts of things related to faith and so forth. But there's a chapter in there on near-death experiences, and you've probably heard of some of these stories, and he uses in his footnotes in that chapter places like the New York Academy of Science, which is no religious organization. So in other words, there have been so many accounts of these near-death experiences that nobody denies them anymore. And basically what they are is like somebody has clinical death. Like there's no EEG, maybe the heart stops for a while, and they float out of their body. You know, you've probably heard of some of these stories. The most famous one you might have heard of, it's out there a lot, is this lady who went somewhere, and then when she came back to life, she said, you know, on the third floor of the hospital, out on the ledge, there's a ratty old sneaker with a shoelace under the heel, and this nurse was like, what? And she went up there and found it. And there's so many of these cases that are documented that you can't deny them anymore. And then, of course, you've also heard about, sometimes they even go to the next room and hear their relatives talking about them. So you got to be careful. But there's also, as you also probably, I'm sure know, everybody knows about this, then they go beyond, and there's like the white tunnel, and they feel this love. And actually, Father Spitzer, people have done like studies, asked all these people's questions, and they put really strict rules on whether they're going to accept what they say or not. And of the small percentage of people, but it's a lot of people who've had clinical death, there's a certain percentage of them, maybe 15%, who have these near-death experiences. And then of that 15%, 85% of them, when they go beyond, have a positive experience. And then 15% of them have kind of a negative, like purgatory or hell experience. And they're glad to come back. But all of them, it has a very positive effect on their life when they come back. And it's distinguished, and Father Spitzer really does this well too in there. There's people who try to prove it's wrong by saying, well, maybe it's because of the drugs they were on, or maybe because of it's a hallucination and so forth. But there's all different ways you can show that even blind people have seen things and then come back and told about it. So it's clear where hallucinations are fuzzy and so forth. Anyways, so that's one. I'm going to have to watch the time too. Maybe I'll talk about some of these other people later, especially Phineas Gage. Do you know about him? Where the metal bar went through his head and it changed his whole personality after. I'll talk about him later. But and then Adrian Owen and Michael Egnor are people who do operations or different things on people, and they take out their whole frontal lobe and they're still having a perfect conversation and so forth. And they're neuroscientists. In other words, brain damage does undeniably affect people's cognitive abilities, obviously. However, there are cases where it doesn't. And that's what's interesting. Because even if you have just one case where it doesn't, then you've shown the soul can think without the brain. Like a near-death experience or some of the examples of Michael Egnor. And then this, especially hydrocephalic. So these are children who are born either without most of their brain, anencephalic, or hydrocephalic, where most of their brain is full of cerebrospinal fluid and not brain tissue. Okay? And so this guy, Professor John Lorber, he decided to study 600 cases of children with this hydrocephalic situation and asked this question, can consciousness exist without the brain? And he found out that around half of 60 children with the most severe type of hydrocephalus and cerebral atrophy had an IQ of higher than 100 and lived normal lives. And I guess he used to love talking about this one in particular. Among them, one university student had excellent grades, a first-class honors degree in mathematics, an IQ of 126, and was socially normal. And the math genius's brain was only 1 millimeter thick, while an average person's is 4.5. So that's this kid's brain. That's all water. It's a little bit of brain tissue. And he was a math genius. So these are some of the empirical evidences that there's, of course, a profound link between the brain and the consciousness, but these indicate that it's not causal, such that the brain seems to be just a condition in many people to be able to be conscious, but it's not the cause of consciousness. Otherwise, this stuff couldn't happen. Okay, I said that. Cases of anencephalic and hydrocephalic children who are conscious offer evidence that not all conscious experiences have neuronal activity associated with them. This gives rise to the question about the source of subjective conscious experiences, and it leads to the idea that the spiritual soul itself is that source, not the matter of the brain. Okay, now some philosophical arguments against neurological reductionism. So, another guy who has a great website about the brain, he says, neuroscientists continue to work to identify all parts of the brain involved in sadness and depression, okay? Even after these brain regions have been cataloged, though, we will still have another important question to answer. What type of dysfunction must occur in them to cause these mood states to emerge? In other words, what happens at the level of neurons that lead someone to feeling sad or depressed? Okay, so that quote, he's like thinking about the woman whose subthalamic nucleus got zapped and she felt sad. And he's universalizing that and saying it explains all types of sadness, okay? Now, have you heard of Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl? Yeah, the Austrian, I want to read a story from the book, and I have it on the screen too, but I'm just going to read this story. It's Frankl talking to a man who's very sad because his wife died. And he's coming to Frankl for a counseling session. The man is a retired doctor. So I'm going to read that. And what we're going to do is we're going to compare the story of zapping the subthalamic nucleus, which had a sad person, and then her sadness was relieved. Now we have another sad person, and his sadness is going to be relieved in a different way. So, once, an elderly general practitioner consulted me because of his severe depression. He could not overcome the loss of his wife, who had died years before, and whom he had loved above all else. Now, how could I help him? What should I tell him? Well, I refrained from telling him anything, but instead confronted him with the question, what would have happened, doctor, if you had died first, and your wife would have had to survive you? Oh, he said, for her this would have been terrible, how she would have suffered. Whereupon I replied, you see, doctor, such a suffering has been spared her, and it was you who have spared her this suffering. To be sure, at the price that now you have to survive and mourn her. He said no word, but shook my hand and calmly left my office. In some way, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning, such as the meaning of a sacrifice. So it's very beautiful. Now, if you ask the question, what caused the suffering in the first story? It was an electrical zap to the subthalamic nucleus. What relieved the suffering? Moving it over. If you ask the question in the second story, what caused his suffering? It was understanding something about reality, namely that his wife passed away. In fact, if he didn't know, like if he was in another country when she died, until he found out, he wouldn't be sad. It was understanding something that made him sad. And then, what did Frankl do? Did he say, sit down, I'm going to give you a little anesthesia and chop off your skull and zap you, you'll be fine? He didn't do that. He talked to the man. He didn't talk to the man's brain, he talked to the self, to the man. And what he did was, he helped him to understand another thing about reality, which was actually true, but he hadn't seen it. That he was the one bearing the pain, not his wife. And that made him feel like he was protecting his wife. And he felt better. He's still sad, but he felt better. And what I want to say is, okay, fine. Maybe when he felt better, there were some different neuronal activities happening, but that does not explain why he felt better. It was nothing physical. It was a spiritual, by spiritual I mean non-physical, understanding of something about reality that made him feel better. It wasn't a drug. Frankl was a psychiatrist in addition to a neurologist. He prescribed drugs. It just wasn't his first. He always wanted to help people find the meaning that was in their lives that they're not seeing. That was his first thing. But of course, if drugs could help a little bit, he would. That wasn't his first resort. So the second case here, it wasn't anything physical that helped him feel better. Okay. Okay, so next philosophical argument. Perhaps most remarkable of all, Michael O'Shea, one of our neurological reductionists, perhaps most remarkable of all, however, is the brain's ability to generate conscious awareness, which convinces you that you are free to choose what you will do next. So the thing I want to say here is that all neurological reductionists, free will is an illusion. So what is free will? I mean, we could have another whole lecture on this, but simply speaking, we can say it's like a spontaneous self-positing from, remember the self I said before, you're thinking about what I'm saying? That same self, you can do things. Like you could say to yourself, you could say, I'm going to stand up right now. Then you do that. That's freedom, okay? So, and it's coming from you. It's coming from the self. I want to stand up and I do it. But neurological reductionists say that every single thing in us, our subjective experience, is caused by brain twitches. And so that's why they deny free will. So it's kind of bizarre, but you have to, if you've never thought this way before, you have to like get out of common sense to be a neurological reductionist. Like you experience yourself as deciding to stand up and walk out of the room freely. And they're saying that's an illusion. You have enough consciousness to sort of feel like you're free, but you're not. It's brain zappings. And the reason is because they really think that every single thing in our conscious life is caused by brain twitches. In other words, it would be true if neurological reductionism were the case, we wouldn't be free. We wouldn't be free. You really have to get out of, I would say, our common everyday experience. Sometimes I think, this is kind of harsh, but it doesn't seem far-fetched, and maybe they're not all doing it consciously. But another aspect of freedom is its connection to responsibility and morality. So a dog who bites someone is a bad dog, but it's not a morally bad dog. Okay, it's just, okay. So okay, but a human, okay, who kills someone or whatever, that's a morally bad person. And in order for moral badness to be a thing, and moral goodness and responsibility, you have to be free. A robot is not morally responsible. A dog is not morally responsible. It doesn't have virtues or vices like we do. I sometimes think that this whole neurological, reductionistic, scientific worldview is nothing more than a bunch of scientists afraid to face, like we all have, their own guilty conscience. You just make a view that gets rid of freedom, and you don't have to deal with morality. I sometimes think that's lurking behind the whole theory. Okay, I think I have just one more of these, and then the religious one, and then we'll be done. The other thing that's funny about that, and then we can have Q&A. Then another thing that's funny about them is, in the same breath that they deny free will, they accept that knowledge is possible. They say that they know that the brain is the source of all subjective experience. Maybe before I go to my next slide, let me put it like briefly. If they really hold the view that all of your conscious experiences are nothing more than being caused by twitches in your brain, then they should say they can't know for sure if the brain really is doing that. They would have to say, but they couldn't even say this. They would have to say, my brain twitches are making me think this way, your brain twitches are making you think the way you think, but none of us can justify it. In reality, it's all being caused by brain twitches. That's what they should say. In other words, according to neurological reductionism, and they really do hold it this strongly, the way to get another person to agree with you would not be to try to convince them about something in reality. It would be to do surgery on their brain to make it act like your brain. Do you see? Okay. So every time they say they know something about reality, they deny neurological reductionism, which says your brain is making you think Sometimes when I explain this to students for the first time, and I even went through this a little bit in grad school, they get scared. My gosh, am I just trapped by my brain making me think everything and I don't know what's out there? It's a scary thought. But I tell them that that very fear is the reason why you don't have to be afraid. Because you actually have knowledge of the difference between your soul knowing something that's real about reality, even like 2 + 2 is 4, and you understand the essence of the philosophical term for being trapped in your brain and not getting to reality would be epistemological determinism. You understand the difference between those two. Epistemological determinism, I'm trapped by my brain, and real knowledge. I can know that 2 + 2 is 4 and my brain didn't make me think it, it's real. You know the difference between those. You're afraid of this one and you want that one. That is knowledge. That's actual knowledge about those two. That's not just your brain making you think those two are different. You can see and understand it. Okay? What's funny about these people is they should stop writing books because they can't hold neurological reductionism and say this is how things really are. They can only say my brain made me think this is how things really are, if their view is true. Okay. The last one, the last argument, and then we can have Q&A. It's a theological argument. This is a quote from Benedict, which is very beautiful, Benedict XVI, Pope. One aspect of the contemporary technological mindset is the tendency to consider the problems and emotions of the interior life from a purely psychological point of view, even to the point of neurological reductionism. In this way, man's interiority is emptied of its meaning, and gradually our awareness of the human soul's ontological depths, as probed by the saints, is lost. It's a kind of a rich quote, but he's basically saying, if you go down the path, it's kind of interesting. They say ideas have consequences. Whatever you think a human being is, that's going to determine how you relate to them, how you relate to the dying process, which I'm going to talk about in a minute here, how you think about love, how you think about the afterlife, how you think about morality, as we said a minute ago. And what Benedict is saying here is, insofar as we go down the path of thinking of ourselves in this way, some people like to say, it's a horrible saying, but we're just meat machines. If you go down that view, then you're going to have a whole different set of ways of thinking about the world and the afterlife and morality and so forth. And you're going to lose a certain depth, he's saying. So I'm going to just pick one example. If you ask people today, how do you want or hope to die? What's a very common answer that people give? They say, fast, sleep, I don't even want to know what happened. All right. There used to be a prayer that Catholics prayed regularly. Oh Lord, deliver me from a sudden death. People used to pray for the exact opposite of what everyone wants today. So what changed? And why did people not want a sudden death? Because the dying, going through the dying process, some authors say is the most important thing you'll ever do, how you go through that. And there used to be these rich traditions in Catholicism which we've lost. One's called Ars Moriendi, which is the art of dying, and one's called Memento Mori, which means remembering, sitting down once in a while and thinking, you know what, I'm going to die someday, I don't know how, but it's going to happen. And that sort of like settles your soul and makes you think about the most important things. And part of this Ars Moriendi, this way to help prepare people for going through the dying process, it was very beautiful. In images, I'm going to have just a couple images here. In prayer books, they would have, especially back around the Black Death, I don't know if you can see that clearly. My next image is in color. But they would have pictures for people to look at, especially when there weren't a lot of priests around to go to confession or talk to, of sins that you're more tempted to give into when you're getting close to death. And then they would have the corresponding virtue next to it. And in another talk, I do more of these. I'm just going to do this one here. But it's very beautiful, and people would look at these and think about them. So on the left-hand image there, you see the sick man in his bed, and the sin is attachment to worldly goods. And so you can see the devils are like pointing at his house and his barn and his horse and his servant. And the guy up there, the devil up there is like, someone else is going to get them. He's all. But then, and that's one of our temptations at the end of life. And then the picture next to it that the sick person is looking at during their prayer time. In this picture, the house is gone, the barn is gone, the horse, the servant, they're all gone. And in their place is Jesus, naked, with nothing, on the cross. And the man is saying, you know, you did this, I can do this. And there are pictures like this for patience and impatience, and people would like look at these and think about them, because through that dying process, some of the most important things in life happen. You maybe make the best confession you ever made in your life. You say things to your loved ones that you've been afraid to say up until that point. You reconcile with people. And it's very important. And you know, we live in kind of a death-averse culture now. We just hide the sick and the dying away, and we don't. So this is a beautiful image. And pictures like this were in prayer books all over the time, all over the place. And people would look at these, and they would know, okay, when it comes my time to die, my people are going to be with me, and they're going to care for me until I die a natural death. They're not going to ignore me, stick me in a room, or euthanize me. And, you know, you see the sick man there in the center of the picture itself. He's the center of attention. He's got those comfy pillows under his head to express comfort. Maybe his sisters or his sister and his cousin are holding his hands. Those guys in the back on the right, maybe those are his friends preparing his will. You got to guess at some of these. The woman in the front could be a nun, or maybe his wife dressed in mourning already praying for him. And there you have the priests preparing the sacraments. The guy in the back there looks to me like a doctor checking a urine sample. I don't know. But everyone's caring for the sick man. And then you see the window, and 3 of the panes are black. So yes, sickness and death is hard. But one of the panes is open with a clear sky. There's eternal life, and there's hope. And this is Ars Moriendi, getting your soul ready to perform, you could say, live through your dying process like this, with support from the community and the faith. Now, the next slide I'm going to show, it's not meant to be a wholesale rejection of modern medicine. I've benefited from modern medicine, which I'm very grateful for. People back then wouldn't have had it, and you probably have too. But I do want to just make a stark contrast between this and that. So she's there, you know, alone, holding a metal bar, not a human hand, in an ugly building. And this, and I think what Benedict's quote is saying is that insofar as we go down the path of materialism, no soul, no God, we drift towards this. And insofar as we go towards soul and God and eternal life, and the soul can survive the death of the body, we drift towards this. Okay, the end. Thank you. Oh, yeah, we'll do Q&A. Yeah. So it looks like we have about 23 minutes for Q&A. Yes?
You're talking about Christianity.
Yeah.
Europeans,
Yeah.
the Native Americans.
Yeah.
Others. Who believe that
Right, yeah. So one thing so there are, as you rightly point out, so she's asking about, because I don't think the thing picks up the question, so maybe I'll repeat the questions a little bit, about different faiths, what they've said related to this compared to Christianity. And one thing I've noticed, first of all, you're right, there's lots of differences between them. For example, Christianity rejects reincarnation because it thinks the body is good. Like your body is God made you, the whole you, your body and your soul, and he loves you. And this idea of flipping around in other bodies and animals means the body is kind of worthless. But it's glorious, the body. And God made it good, and it's you. But those views that hold to reincarnation, and there's many of them, like Hindu and Buddhist and even Socrates, who have a more negative view of the body, they do, as you rightly say, all have in common this idea that the spiritual soul is stronger than the body and can live beyond it. Then, like the Buddhists and the Hindus kind of think it's sort of panpsychism. It dissolves, you lose your individuality in the end. And the Christian would say you have your individuality even stronger in the end, and so would Socrates. So the short answer is, from the religion side, there is this sort of overwhelming agreement that the soul is stronger than the body. But then there's all these differences because of certain things. Yep. Right. Okay. All right, you got one.
we have reduced.
Yeah.
Because I have.
Right.
I hear you talk about brain.
Right.
I would say that every.
Right.
But it was never.
Yeah. Yeah, I could have said that at the beginning. So I am in this, so I sometimes teach a course called Philosophy and Neuroscience, and we can stretch it out over a whole semester and talk about, there's all sorts of different views besides the one I presented here. Lots of different views, and even more on the faith. Like there's this one kind of bizarre idea. It's a very, very, I don't know how many people hold it, hardly any, a Christian view that, which holds to neurological reductionism, but says that, so when you die, I said your soul is going to like be in purgatory or something and then back together. But there are some Christians who hold to that when you die, there's nothing because your brain is creating you, but then God is going to reconstitute your brain and then you're going to come back. So you could hold to that if you wanted to believe in an afterlife. But yeah, no, you're right though that that there are a whole range of views, and I did pick sort of the starkest one. But even what you said, to use the word brain twitch, you're right. And I said before, I am amazed at the brain and the complexity of it and the beauty of it, and it shows God's glory. And I was kind of in this talk really trying to show the problems with reducing all of human existence to being created by the brain. Yeah. Okay, I forget. Okay, I'm going to do like in order. 1, 2, and then I thought there was another hand that I missed. Okay, 3. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Okay. Right. 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 Life is dukkha.
So it's so wonderful to see that.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, it's a beautiful quote.
So you alluded to that behind my eyes. Stop.
Well,
Where else does it reside?
so yeah. So maybe the short version to the question would be, but tell me if I get anything wrong. Where exactly is consciousness? And this might fit with some of these questions too. So it's only very recent that people who are materialistic in this sense, or it's really called epiphenomenalism, rooted in the brain. So I'm not an expert on ancient Egypt, but from what I understand, when people would die and they would embalm them, they would like stick some hanger type thing up their nose, rip their brain out and chuck it, but it was the heart. If I was teaching this lecture 3,000 years ago in Egypt, I'd have to switch heart for brain for everything I said. I'm saying, can you believe these people think the heart thinks instead of the brain thinks? Okay? Or if you think about, and this will relate to your question. So remember when I said you can feel your hand? Yourself, and you know this from doing yoga, you feel yourself throughout your whole body. And if somebody pricks your toe with a pin and your finger with a pin at the same time, you don't have to like move to feel it. You feel it in your spiritual self. And what's interesting about that idea is that your self is present in your whole soul, whole body. People who have wanted to hold on to materialism have realized that if I say it's just in my brain, how do I explain that my soul is everywhere? So there are materialists who pick not a specific organ, like brain or heart. Some pick air, which they say is physical. And one of the reasons they pick it is because when your last breath goes out, you die. But air could be everywhere, and you are everywhere. And there are other materialists for the same reason who picked blood instead of a specific organ. But what I'm saying is, and what Socrates would say, is that your soul is not physical. It's not air, it's not blood, it's not a heart, it's not a brain, it's not any organ. It is a spiritual, non-physical substance that has faculties in it like an intellect, which is also non-physical, a will, which is also non-physical, and the ability to experience emotions, which is also not physical. And so when this soul leaves the body and it's separate from the body, and it's really interesting to read the stories in Father Spitzer's chapter there. The people, even though they don't have eyes, they can see and hear, and they have feelings and thoughts. But there's nothing physical. Okay, so what I'm saying, and as you said, it's very complex, and we would need a lot more. It's a mystery. In fact, we can't solve it in this life. But we can think about all these questions and really think about them deeply. So what seems to me to be the case is the body and the soul are two substances miraculously and mysteriously together with each other, with all sorts of relationships between them. Like, just think for a minute about, like, happiness. If someone says, oh, there's a happy face, see a happy face. Do you mean teeth are happy? Do you mean skin cells are happy? No, but you say the face is happy. What is that? In some utterly amazing way, human expression is a miracle. The things that we think and feel, which are not physical, become immediately present in the look in someone's eye, the tone of their voice, their posture. The body-soul union is so intimate that it's hard to find words to express it. But I am saying, and people can disagree, that if your question, where is consciousness? It's in the spiritual soul, which is miraculously united to a body and was never supposed to be separate from it. But I don't think anything physical can think. The body is the body is amazing. I'd like to do another talk about the beauty of the human body, but right now I'm trying to separate the soul and the body for this talk, but I don't really mean it. It's amazing. Death should never have happened. I mean, but
Can I just make a comment?
yeah.
Just, it reminds me of thought process.
Then so see, that was the soul affecting the brain, not the brain affecting.
The other way too,
Yes.
the brain chemistry.
Yes, like for example, if you drink alcohol, you get woozy. If you ask the woman who got her subthalamic nucleus zapped, what are you sad about? Would she say anything? No. If someone drinks alcohol and you say, let's say someone, they should never do this obviously, but gives alcohol to a child and the kid's woozy and you say, what are you woozy about? It's a ridiculous question. But if you ask the man, what are you sad about? There's an answer. And that is, my wife passed away. So, very good. So there are directions. So sometimes if a chemical thing goes off in your brain, something happens in your soul that surprises you. And it's determined. The problem with the neurological reduction is they think that's the only direction. But the soul also has imprints on the body, the other direction. Thank you very much for that. The other direction, like human expression, for example. Okay, so were you number 2? Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. Typically in those cases, as he said, well, the way he puts it is most brain activity has ceased in those cases. I don't know if you want to talk about brain death, but what? Right. Mm-hmm. Oh. Oh. Yeah. Yeah. There can be, so Frankl would say, there are things that influence us. Yeah, let me check we still have 9 minutes. There are things that influence us in the concentration camps, the reason Frankl wrote Man's Search for Meaning is because he was a prisoner in there, but he was also a psychologist. And he was struck by the fact that some of the prisoners were very happy and very self-sacrificial and so forth, and others actually became more mean to their fellow prisoners than even the Nazis, and those were the capos. And Frankl was trying to understand what the difference was. And he admitted that he criticizes Freud because he says in that book that Freud says that if you throw anyone into a pressure cooker like that, they'll become what we would call morally bad and the fit for survival. They all will. And Frankl said, he's wrong, and so are all the textbooks. Some people became saints, and Frankl says some people became swine. And while granting that the external pressures, and we've all experienced things like peer pressure and so forth, do have an influence, Frankl does not let people get away with not being responsible. He says the reason why the ultimate reason why people became a swine or a saint is because they picked it. Suffering gives you a chance to decide how you're going to be. He even says in cases of psychosis, you never lose touch with your free will. It's harder for some people than other people, but he just won't countenance this idea that at some point a human becomes a robot. Yeah. Right. 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 So there are levels of culpability. Like, some people can plead insanity and be less culpable, and some people there was a lot of pressure, and so they're less guilty than someone who's totally premeditated and so forth. I would also say, in answer to what you just said, is that also those indirect influences on us, we're responsible for a lot of those. If we spend our time watching violent things all the time, then we make ourselves more violent. So there's not no responsibility, even though, well, I want to just go in order.
Growing up in a world
Right.
they're not choosing.
Right. Yeah, okay, yeah. Good point. No, I'm not, right. I'm all for everything that exculpates people and compassion and mercy, and I'm all for that. What I'm not for is saying that if there's a human person, that person has free will. It can be diminished, it can be hard to use, but it's essential, it's the essence of, it's not the only thing, but it's the essence of being human to be free. And that is always there. In fact, if I want to flip it the way you guys are going, what we would do is pour out our compassion on that person to help them get in touch with their free will more. And say, you still have your free will, you can choose this good act. And over time, if you do it, you'll become better and better. I like it. Oh, yeah. Yeah, so what I was going to say about Adrian Owen, and I think this goes with your directional point, so this is really striking. So now, I have seen about that one. So what I'm going to say is something a little different, but it's in the same category, but I haven't studied that one. But that would, yeah, I'll say something about yours in a second, but I think this is connected. This is really striking. So this guy, Adrian Owen, he wanted to find out if people in comatose states who everyone thought couldn't hear you could hear you. And so he put all these things on, and he said to the people, and he did it so much, it's proven statistically, and now he's hired to make these machines so people can care for their loved ones by communicating with them. So he said, think about playing tennis over and over and over. Then he said, think about walking through your home over and over and over. And he got it down. So I didn't know this, but some part of the brain lights up totally different tennis than walking through your home. It was a good. Then he said, think about tennis if the answer is yes. Think about walking through your home if the answer is no. And then he started asking them all questions. Is your father's name Tom? Over and over. And he got it down, and they were communicating. And you can look him up, Adrian Owen. And now he's British, I think, but some people in Canada hired him to make this into a little machine that people can care for their loved ones at home and actually ask them questions through this method. So there, a thought is causing a brain process, not a brain process causing a thought. Now, with yours, this would be like huge if they ever do this. But the idea, I think, is that if you can chart every single solitary brain process and even maybe atom in the brain that goes with each word or something, then maybe you could watch that and make the sentences. Although I think that's going to be a long time if they ever do that. But right, right. Right, a hologram or something. No, it's not. It's not. That's not a person. That's like people already kind of try to do that now. Like they've collected someone who died, all their text messages, and they put them in a program and a few other things about them, and then their friends are texting them, but they're dead. But all that is, and the way you're describing it would be maxing it out. But that's not the person. That's just sort of kind of somewhat accurately what they might say. It's not the person. So, but okay. So thank you very much.